This is the simple teaching that Jesus gives us today. And it's not like he's asking us to run a marathon and then do 100 consecutive backflips. It's fairly straightforward. Love God and love neighbor. So why do we have so much trouble doing this? Why is it so hard in our daily lives to do this consistently and all the time? And I think at the end of the day, it's because what Jesus is really offering us here is a two-step recipe for heartbreak. And I don't mean the kind of heartbreak that comes at the end of just a relationship or the loss of a loved one. I mean the sort of generalized heartbreak that happens when something happens that you can't undo. An event that is now in the past, that now belongs to yesterday, and you know you can't go back to yesterday. It can be as simple as saying something you really wish you hadn't said, or not saying something you wish you had said in the moment, or dropping and breaking that plate that you loved that you can't unbreak now. It can be as big as the impossibility of getting undivorced or unevicted from your home. It's always about something that took place that you wish had gone differently, but you can't go back in time and fix it. Atlanta sports fans, Falcons fans, Braves fans, Georgia fans know what this is like. It's this feeling in your body and in your mind, and yet somehow bigger, that you just wish things had gone differently, and now you're stuck with it. And so why do I say that this feeling of heartbreak is what would result from this quite wonderful commandment of Jesus, is to love God and love neighbor? Well, think about loving God with all of your mind and your heart and your soul. I mean, maybe you've gotten comfortable with a certain story about yourself. A story where maybe you don't like yourself very much, or you think you're awkward, or you're very self-critical, and maybe you don't like yourself at all. But to love God that much, you sort of have to realize that God loves you first. Because you can't love God with all of your heart if you think that God doesn't even like you. So to feel loved like that, it's going to require letting go of this story that you've told yourself about who you are. Loving God is going to disrupt the story about what makes you special. You can no longer just pin it on where you were born, or how smart you are, or how kind you are. And that disruption, that change to who you think you are, is going to feel like heartbreak, because you can't go back. And what about loving our neighbor? Don't need to tell you that loving people can result in heartbreak. If you love your neighbor, one of three things is going to happen, I think. Either you hurt them, they hurt you, or you hurt with them. And I don't mean to be like horribly negative here. There's tons of joy and beautiful moments and wonderful, sweet, romantic things in life, but there's also just things that go wrong. People don't live up to your expectations. They break a promise. They say they're gonna buy milk on the way home from work, and they don't do it. If we pretended it's all rainbows and puppies, we're gonna be disappointed. We need to reflect on the fact that there is some heartbreak involved in life. And so if Jesus is saying, love God, love your neighbor, and both of those things are going to actually require taking on more heartbreak, experiencing more heartbreak, then why would we do that? It's hard enough just being us. It's hard enough dealing with our own heartbreak. Why would we ask for more? And so we try to get out of this experience of heartbreak. We try to dodge this commandment. And in the 2,000 years since Jesus taught this lesson, there's been 1,000 different creative ways that we have sought to dodge it. But three of the top ones are that we try to divide the commandment itself. We redefine who counts as a neighbor, and we shift responsibility for who needs to act. And dividing the commandment, you'll notice the theologian in this case asks Jesus for one commandment, the top commandment of all the commandments in the law. What is the number one? And Jesus just gives two. No wonder people get so frustrated talking to Jesus all the time, because he never answers the question the way you expect. Jesus refuses to split these two commandments. He says you love God and you love your neighbor. Have you ever met someone who claims to love God and honestly does, but just does not seem to be able to love their neighbors consistently? I mean, most of my friends who are just done with religion or God, they're not actually upset with God. They're upset with people they've met or churches that they've experienced that loved God and just failed to love their neighbor. This is a very easy trap to fall into. And for example, today in the life of the church, it is Reformation Sunday. This is when we commemorate the anniversary of the Great Reformation, the split from Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And now, this wasn't the first reform movement. This wasn't the first time the church split over something. It certainly won't be the last. This is just the one that produced Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists, our own tradition. And so we commemorate it for what it got right, without pretending it got everything right. I think it's too easy to go back and look at something like the Great Reformation and say, well, they got it wrong all those years, and we finally figured out what life with God is supposed to be like. But the reality is that all reform movements come from this place of trying to balance those two commandments. Someone comes along and says, hey, I think you're getting the love God part right, but you're missing out on the loving your neighbor. Or you're loving neighbor, but you've forgotten to love God, and so you're doing it just to show how, sweet and generous you are. So we divide the commandment, and it's always been the case for us. The other thing that we do quite often is we just redefine neighbor. I mean, as Luke tells this same story, the very first question out of someone's mouth after Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor, the guy turns around and says, well, okay, but who's my neighbor? Who counts? Took him about 10 seconds to try to redefine neighbor, and we do the same thing. We love our neighbor, but we don't necessarily count as our neighbor the folks who sleep outside, maybe. Or that one neighbor who always complains about how we're not mowing our lawn the right way. Or the people who don't wear masks. Or the people who vote for the wrong political party. They're not our neighbor. I think it's so easy to redefine our way out of neighbor because we are seeking to avoid taking on their heartbreak. And when it feels like the amount of heartbreak in the world is overwhelming, if we can just cut a few people off of the definition, then, well, it makes it a lot easier to get by. And that's the same thing that happens when we duck responsibility. It's so easy when we hear of something tragic happening to somebody, something heartbreaking, literally, we turn around and we start blaming the victim. Or we come up with some sort of easy answer, some easy explanation like, well, that's just the way the economy works. That's the price of progress. But these easy explanations often are just an excuse for us to not feel deeply. On Thursday night, this past Thursday, a good friend of mine who is black was in a home that he owns, and police barged in the door. They accused him of being a home invader. They threw him to the ground. They held him down. They choked off his airways. Now, he's okay. He's traumatized. But eventually they realized that it was his property, that he was there legally, and in fact, there was no crime being committed, and they should never have been in the house in the first place. This happens every day in America. Black folks experiencing police violence like this. And we don't want to think about it happening every day because it's heartbreaking. My heart is broken thinking about this guy right now, and I can't fix it. It happened in the past. I can't undo it. So that is why I think sometimes really otherwise decent, kind, generous people will start blaming the victim or saying, well, that's just the way it's got to be for law and order, because they don't want to hold the heartbreak. They don't want to reflect on the reality. Or maybe they let it close them off so much that they can't feel empathy for other people. If that same cop who hurt my friend, if something happened to him tomorrow, I hope that I would be able to feel heartbreak for him. So I'm not saying this is easy, but what would it look like if we were willing to be heartbroken a little bit more? What would it look like if we actually tried to fulfill this commandment and not just duck it? Well, I don't think we'd be perfect. But I don't think God expects that of us. God will love us no matter what. That's the message of Scripture. I think we'd have to pay attention to where we catch ourselves blaming people. I think we'd have to pay attention to where we're rushing to easy explanations instead of just sitting with heartbreak. We'd have to learn to feel that heartbreak instead of trying to find something that's happy that distracts us all the time. And sometimes we need that as a form of self-care, but sometimes we know it's an unhealthy escape. I think we need a community where you can share heartbreaks and lament together. I think we need to find a new trust in God because we know deep down we can't hold all of this heartbreak on our own. But if we're more willing to let our hearts be broken and more willing to love, I think we'd be better friends, better parents, better partners, spouses, better co-workers, better citizens, better neighbors. And I actually think we'd be more joyful. And this doesn't sound like it makes any sense. I'm saying let's be heartbroken more of the time, and then I'm saying it's going to make us joyful. And you're sitting here thinking, well, I can barely handle my own heartbreak. And now I'm coming along and saying, okay, pile up all of the heartbreak you experienced, and then add to it all the heartbreak of your friends, all the heartbreak of your family, all of Atlanta, all the people who live way OTP who think they live in Atlanta, all of the heartbreak of Georgia and the US and the whole world, all of the heartbreak of God's creation crying out, and you're thinking, Colin, man, I can't hold that. And you don't have to. That's why we fall back on God. The truth of God is that no matter how much heartbreak there is, there's more joy. The truth of God is that inside of heartbreak is joy. That joy includes heartbreak. That they're not opposites. That joy encompasses heartbreak. That's cross and resurrection. That's death and life. That's the whole story. All of the heartbreak now and from every moment in the past, every moment in the future, rests on the shoulders of Jesus of Nazareth. It all gets nailed to the cross, and it is not too much for God. Authentic spirituality begins with heartbreak, but it doesn't end there. It expands our capacity to have our hearts broken, but then once we're no longer scared of that much heartbreak, then we're no longer afraid to love. And living in love without fear, that's joy. That's that experience of joy that transcends yourself and makes you forget about your worries without losing who you are. In both joy and heartbreak, somehow we're here, we're in our minds, we're in our bodies, and yet we're in touch with something way bigger. So yes, Jesus is giving us a two-step recipe for heartbreak, but it's more than that. It's an invitation to live inside of heartbreak instead of avoiding it. To live inside of heartbreak, to share each other's burdens, and because we're no longer trying to avoid having our hearts broken, no longer willing to hurt other people to avoid our own heartbreak, because heartbreak no longer scares us, living inside of heartbreak means that we are living inside of joy. So Jesus asks us to love God with all our heart and all our mind and all our soul, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we know it's going to be hard. We know we won't be perfect. But we're going to try it anyway. We will find joy when we let our hearts be broken.